There's a classic scene from the Simpsons TV show where, I only got 6 words in, where Bart pranks his devout neighbours Rod and Todd Flanders and impersonates God to ask them to bring cookies to his house. And the boys question this divine imperative, and Bart says, "Look, do you want a happy God or a vengeful God?" And the younger Flanders, of course, says, "Happy God." I think most of us want a happy God, and quite understandably, quite a few people may long for a vengeful God for one reason or another. And today, in the passage from the book of the prophet Isaiah, we get a not happy God, and that is where we focus today, which will be super fun and traumatic. So let's get context first and then discern the presence of Christ in all of it. And I mean that in a spiritual sense and for guiding our conduct, not just referring to the many messianic prophecies in Isaiah. So some basics. The book of the prophet Isaiah is literarily depicted as the work of one prophet, but historically it covers a period from 742 onwards for a couple of hundred years. So this covers the period of the invasions and conquest of the Holy Land by the Assyrian Empire and later the Babylonians. So there is, of course, deep soul-searching going on. Why is this all happening? Why is this happening to God's chosen people? Now this is fraught territory to go into because honestly, I think a large cohort of people these days would be inclined to side with the victim of aggression. It's generally abhorrent to ascribe blame to the victims of another nation's aggression. And with the fewest of exceptions, I'd contend that instinct is right and true. Like, were the Christians in early 20th century Russia to blame for their murders and persecution when the Communist Party took charge? No. Were the Armenian people to blame for their genocide by the Turks? No. Like, is God on Russia's side or Ukraine? Like, just pick conflict. But here in Isaiah, interestingly, we get a case of the one whom we might otherwise cast as the victim, describing their own experience under inspiration from God, and they find and describe within all that has been going on what God's purpose has been and why. And the meaning is quite typical of the prophets. The religious observance of the people is abhorrent because of the conduct which goes on otherwise, which renders their religion hypocritical. God's judgment is that the people's hands are full of blood. They do evil. And rather, they have to learn to do good, to seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, and plead for the widow. Because they don't do those things well, they're in trouble. Vengeful God, not happy God. A nearly identical diagnosis is given repeatedly also by the prophets Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Malachi, Zechariah, whilst Hosea, Micah and Amos, they've got more of a flavour towards economic justice towards the poor. This stuff is important, right? Because happy God. We want a happy God. But let's see how the prophet defines those things, because the mention of orphans and widows is quite specific, whereas references to like justice and the oppressed are more generic. And as said, I think we should try and get this right. If we're part of a member of a nation or some other meaningful, organised group of people, and it's flagrantly, rampantly engaged in not godly practices, I'd expect and even hope that God's judgment would set things right. I mean, I want to help out and contribute towards fixing things, and in this world now, not just the kingdom to come. So first, with widows and orphans, we should realise that the average life expectancy now is far higher than the world of the Old Testament. Moses had a really good run when he was playing full forward for the Lord, yep, but talking averages. Life was riskier for all sorts of reasons, and there were hardly robust national social security networks. And society was also simply geared heavily towards exclusion of females in preference to males. So if a woman lost her husband in her 20s or 30s, if she had no male protector, whether a husband, son or father, effectively it meant she had no income, couldn't argue her own legal cases, she could be defrauded. She was legitimately at comprehensive risk, and it wasn't as if she had the opportunity or societal permission to gain education, skills or employment. Different time. And this is similarly the case for orphans. Again, you can definitely find women absolutely being awesome leaders in the Old Testament, but we're talking on balance at scale. The point is, care of widows and orphans is like baseline spiritual, moral and social. It's a spiritual, moral and social gauge, right? Revealing the extent to which the people are interested in arranging their society in a godly way. And as God cautioned in the book of Exodus, do not take advantage of a widow or orphan. If you do and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. I do wonder how many of the little children who would flock to Jesus were actually orphans. How many? And thus, the care and compassion shown is a sign of fulfillment of that message which was saturated through the Old Testament. That is, the Spirit of Christ is clearly to be seen in all of those previous prophetic injunctions. The application then is pretty obvious in principle. Arrange group life at whatever level to take care of those who are vulnerable. And that is where the vision opens up beyond widows and orphans. Because whilst not everyone would fit neatly into those categories, there is more fluidity of understanding when it comes to the vulnerable, the oppressed, the need to seek justice. And the key word here, I think, is the one for justice, which is one of those words particularly worth understanding in Hebrew, I mean. The word is mishpat, and it appears many times in the Hebrew scriptures, often in conjunction with tzedakah. I don't know how to pronounce it, sorry. Meaning righteousness. Mishpat and tzedakah are core to who God is. It is literally written in Isaiah 30, the Lord is a God of mishpat. And like many words, its meaning is multi-layered. It's variously translated as justice, judgment, and governing rightly. So it includes a sense of legal verdicts, like making judgment, in the context of actively pursuing the good of the oppressed and those who are victims. Isaiah says, mishpat is what we should seek. The prophet Micah urges us to do mishpat. And Amos says, let it roll on like a river. Practicing mishpat is storing up treasures in heaven. So to return to the Flanders, Do we want a happy God or a vengeful God? And if you're honest, we might want both, depending on the day. When we're the ones wronged or see wrong happening, we long for a God who will put things right, who sees the blood which is shed and says, enough. That's the God we meet in Isaiah. A God who cares too much to stay silent. A God whose anger, unlike ours, is holy, not petty, not vengeful for vengeance's sake, but in the service of justice, in the service of healing. But we also want, and we absolutely need, a God who is more than righteous anger. A God who doesn't just rage at the brokenness of the world, but steps into it. Who doesn't just demand justice, but extends mercy. And in Jesus, that's exactly who we meet. The happy God. The profound joy of a God who delights to restore what has been lost, who welcomes the widow, holds the orphan, even the ones with blood on their hands. In Christ, the vengeful God doesn't disappear, but takes that judgment upon himself, bears the full weight of injustice on the cross so that justice and mercy meet. That's what makes the God of Isaiah, the God of Jesus, the God who is Jesus, the real living Holy One, calls us to lives of compassion, conviction, and costly service. But may we seek justice not out of fear of a vengeful God. Perfect love casts out fear. But let's do it because we've encountered the joy of the just and merciful one, who in Christ has made peace with us and calls us to make peace with the world.